Chapter 1. The Door. He slammed the key I kept. They said quiet women disappear. I decided to echo. He didn't leave with a speech, he left with a sentence that tried to shrink me. You were never going to be enough. I didn't argue. I learned a different language, hinges and light frames and patience. I put my name on every threshold I built, small in the corner, a key embossed like a pulse. I didn't chase his praise. I made rooms where strangers cried and felt better. When he finally came back to see the doors behave the way dignity does, they opened not for him, but for the life I chose. 2 months earlier, when the echo was still learning its shape, his text arrived while I was laying a seam of gold leaf along the lip of a miniature door. Dylan had always said those pieces were too on the nose, like I needed metaphors to apologize for being literal about needing an exit. The phone vibrated on the work table, rattling a little jar of tacks. First message, you weren't ever going to be enough, Rach. Second message, I'm moving forward. Don't make this dramatic. I looked at the tiny hinge I'd just gilded and pressed it into place with my thumb. In the kitchen, the kettle clicked off a domestic full stop. I poured water over the tea leaves and listened to the apartment do what empty rooms do, hold their breath. My sketch taped above the easel carried my name the way I like to see it are. Merritt clear, steady the serif like a shoulder you could lean on and not apologize for it. We had been together 3 years. His plans required my faith. My work required cross-examination. Dylan was a music producer in theory and a collector of IOUs in practice. He said the city didn't understand vision, which often meant the rent arrived late, and my savings steadied us while he auditioned the next chapter. He called my canvases nice, the way you call a dress nice when you don't want to admit it looks better on the woman than you expected. Safe, he said, about the quiet color I love about frames that don't need to shout to be seen. The night before his text, he stood halfway between my studio and the living room and pronounced the verdict he had been rehearsing. You're a coffee shop painter. That's fine. Just don't pretend you're building something people line up for. Some insults bruise and fade. Some turn fossil and fix a layer in you. I didn't respond. Instead, I made a list because lists have spine. I erased him from the daily systems of my life. Then I added what wasn't administrative, returned my grandmother's ring to the box that smells like cedar glue, the loose edge of gold leaf on the miniature door. Take the tiny key from the dish by the sink and put it where it belongs. His grandmother had given me that key months earlier with the casual ceremony women use when they want to bless you without embarrassing you. You have the kind of hands that won't lose things, she'd said. I put the key in my pocket and walked to the bank. The metal was warm within a minute, as if it remembered bodies. The woman at the vault recognized me not by name, but by an idea. You're the artist with the doors, she said, and I nodded, both grateful and shy. I signed the card, the pen leaving a groove deeper than ink, and tucked a small envelope of papers into the metal box receipts, a lease addendum, a quiet promise to myself that I would sign my name without shrinking. On my way home, I passed a storefront that had been asleep for months. Dust softened the glass. The arch over the door curved like a half-closed eyelid. A flyer hung crooked short-term rentals considered. Dylan would have laughed at the optimism of that sentence. I lifted my phone, took a photo, and saved the number anyway. Something in the shape of that arch asked a question I wanted to answer. Back in the apartment, I gathered the last evidence of us. A chipped mug with a crack like a hairline on a forehead. The gray hoodie he wore when he wanted to look like effort hadn't failed him. A plant that leaned toward his preferred window. I boxed them without ceremony, the way you put winter clothes away in early spring, not with hatred, just with honesty. In my studio, I opened the notebook I use for the unsellable thumbnail truths and background thoughts that would never ask to be framed, and drew a door that wasn't pretty. Paint cracked, frame warped just enough to admit weather. I printed my name in full on a tiny brass plate. Not just Merritt, as if I were borrowing somebody else's spine, but Rachel, the whole of me. Beneath it, I wrote, every door I build carries my name. If they don't, I won't enter. The first week alone felt like a house after a storm. Too much air. Sounds traveled strangely. I woke early because mornings argue less stretched raw canvas across old frames until the staples sang, move the dining table to make room for ambitions. I made a new list: small doors, medium doors, tall doors, doors that were hardly doors at all, just the argument of light across a threshold, just the suggestion that a wall could change its mind if you asked gently. On each piece, I pressed a small gold key silhouette into the corner, low, quiet, like a pulse. You notice only when you touch it on purpose. A month passed in the rhythm of coffee primer lint roller lunch that forgot to happen. Sunlight crawling across the floor like a well-behaved cat. Then the cafe owner from the corner emailed, "We have a bare wall. Would you consider 3 pieces I brought 9 because sometimes you have to let a room choose you." 2 sold the first weekend. One buyer was a real estate agent with soft-soled shoes and an eye that noticed hinges before color. "These feel like promises," she said, placing a hand on the tiny knocker I had glued into the paint, as if an oil slick had hardened into invitation. I wish someone had taught me that a closed door can be generous. Her sentence moved through me like tidewater quiet total. I called the number on the dusty storefront and met the landlord in a room that smelled like dust and lemon cleaner. He was suspicious in the way men who own buildings learn to be too many stories that began artistic and ended unpaid. I put 3 months' rent on the table and asked for one thing: permission to paint the door any color I wanted. "People notice doors," I said. "If this one is beautiful, they will stop." He shrugged because hope made him shy, took the check, and slid a ring of keys across the table. One key was smaller than the rest, not brass exactly, but gold from where a bright coin of usefulness. I didn't wait for the right week or the right weather. I painted through the night with the radio low and the windows cracked. By dawn, the glass was clean, the door the color of champagne when it throws its first light. I cut a thin line of gold leaf around the frame, not gaudy, just a memory of celebration. I pressed my little key mark into the corner and turned the lock. The bell above the door made a sound that wasn't pretty, but was true, like an old house sighing, because someone had finally asked it a kind question. I did not invite Dylan to the opening. He had moved his moving forward into a rental in a neighborhood that wished it were a memory. Mutual friends reported that he was fine, a word people use when they're tired of describing someone else's weather. He sent one last text on a forgettable Thursday: "I'm glad you're doing your little shop." I let the syllables evaporate in the same air that dried my paint and used whatever heat remained in me to sand a frame smoother until my hand came away unsplintered. My quiet became a room with a lease and a door that would not apologize. The first customer who wasn't already on my phone walked in on a Tuesday, a woman in her 50s, dark coat, hands that looked busy in their rest. She pressed her palm to the glass of a piece called Threshold East and cried without looking ashamed of it. "I used to wait in doorways," she said, "half to me, half to the wood. Now I walk through." She bought it and asked if I would help her hang it at home, because rulers made her sad. We used ribbon instead, measuring the wall like a wrist for a bracelet. When we stepped back, the room did a small lift, the way a chest does when relief remembers how to breathe. I began carrying the gold key not as a charm, but as a tool, letting it sit in my pocket with the lint and the receipts and the courage. People started noticing when I locked up. "Is that part of the art?" a woman asked one evening as I turned it. "It's the agreement," I said before I had decided to say anything. "I promise the door will open. The door promises to behave." She laughed in the pocket of air that sits between strangers when the right sentence appears. I started photographing hands on keys, wrinkled, inked, wedding banded, bare. I pinned the printouts on a corkboard behind the desk. People mailed me theirs like postcards, keys that learned my hands. One note read in block letters that felt like a person making their own alphabet. A friend of a friend with a camera and a following posted the door on a Sunday morning. The street did what algorithms do when they get a good night's sleep. More footsteps, more photos, couples practicing the choreography of arriving together. The landlord came by late one afternoon, pretending to fix a radiator that wasn't broken just to stand in the doorway and look pleased. "People keep taking pictures," he said, hat in hand, voice lighter, like tourists in their own town. I smiled and gave him a paper cup of grocery store coffee we treated like sacrament. Doors are their own advertisements, I said. You give a passerby a question mark, they write the sentence. The small sales did more than pay rent. They changed the grammar of my choices. I stopped buying paint like it was a guilty pleasure. I ordered frames in lots. I said no to favors that didn't believe in themselves and yes to commissions that asked for welcome rather than spectacle. When the cafe asked for 3 more, I brought 6. When the agent commissioned a set for a lobby, she gave me 5 adjectives and a budget that didn't flinch. Make them feel like a future has a hinge, she said. I made them feel like a shoulder, remembering it didn't have to carry so much. At night, I walked home past the window of the shop after turning off the lights and stood on the sidewalk to look at my own door like a stranger. The thin line of gold around the frame caught headlights and turned them into manners. I couldn't hear the bell from the street, but imagination supplied it. I thought about my name in the corner of each canvas, the tiny key silhouette pressed there, like a signature that chose understatement over fear. I thought about his sentence and how I had let it be an opening parenthesis instead of a period. The month closed with a quiet ceremony of receipts and sweeping. I vacuumed the corners where sawdust collects like polite grief. I wiped fingerprints from the glass little ghosts of strangers who had steadied themselves on my work. I turned the sign to closed and kept working because beginnings have poor boundaries, and that can be a kindness. The room held its breath with me, not out of tension, but out of attention. I placed the gold key back in the dish by the sink and watched it sit there looking less like inheritance and more like equipment. I thought of his grandmother, of her confidence in my hands, of the way a woman can give another woman permission without a mission statement. I set a piece of paper next to the key and wrote a line in the simplest handwriting I have: not success, alignment. When I finally turned off the light, the door did not feel like protection from the world. It felt like an invitation to it. I stood there for an extra breath, as if I might hear an answer from the wood, from the hinge, from whatever patient God minds thresholds. The bell above me gave one tiny sound as the air shifted a note small enough to be a secret and clear enough to be a promise. I didn't rebuild. I realigned. Chapter 2. Keys. Learn your hands. They said quiet women disappear. I decided to echo. The second year taught me what the first only whispered thresholds require: maintenance. The romance of an opening fades. What's left is the steady practice of keeping things open without letting the weather in. The gallery smelled of primer and ambition. The landlord came one morning with a wrench and a grin that wasn't hiding behind suspicion anymore. People keep taking pictures of your door, he said, twisting a valve. They stand out there like tourists in their own town. I laughed and handed him a cup of burnt coffee. Doors are their own advertisements, I said. You give a passerby a question mark, they write the sentence. After that, more sentences arrived. The cafe owner sent 2 more buyers, and the real estate agent who'd once called my canvases promises came back with a new commission. Make a lobby feel like a future, has a hinge, she said. I made 6 pieces, each one painted with light so soft it looked like forgiveness. The invoices were the most beautiful letters I wrote that year. I learned to price without apology. To say numbers the way you say your own name, clear, unflinching. The gallery stopped being an experiment and started being a structure that held. Dylan's name reappeared once, not as a message, but as rumor. A mutual friend said he'd landed a production gig out of state and was finally surrounded by people who get him. I stirred paint and thought about all the times I'd tried to get him, like a child trying to catch fog in a jar. When people came into the gallery and asked what inspired my doors, I answered honestly without naming him. I paint what I needed and couldn't find, I said. Now anyone can. By spring, I'd developed a habit of carrying the gold key, not like a charm, but like a tool. When I locked up each night, customers began to notice. Is that part of the art? One woman asked as I turned the key. It's the agreement, I told her, surprised at my own certainty. I promise the door will open. The door promises to behave. After that, I started photographing hands turning keys, old, young, scarred, wedding-ringed bare. I pinned the prints on a corkboard behind the counter. Visitors began sending their own photos. little postcards from thresholds keys that learned my hands. One note read, another said, "The door and I practice trust now." The board became an accidental atlas of courage. Midway through that year, a developer came by. "You're becoming a brand," he said, his tone a mix of awe and alarm. "You could expand. The empty space next door's available." I smiled. Growth doesn't ask permission, it just knocks again. He chuckled, unsure if I was saying yes or no, so I said both. I took the lease. I knocked through the wall and built a wide frame between the rooms, but left it doorless. A reminder not all thresholds need locks. The new space invited different visitors. One afternoon, a young architect lingered before a tall piece until I worried she'd gone faint. "I design entrances that meet code and budget," she said. "But your doors, they measure something else. Temper, relief, the way light minds its manners." She came back later with 3 colleagues. We talked about arches grace and the geometry of welcome. The next morning I woke with a sentence humming under my tongue. "A door is polite because it knows it takes up space." A few weeks later, an email arrived from a museum across town. Someone had seen the keyboard online. They were curating a show called Hold Release. The note was concise. "We're interested in the social life of thresholds, how they manage fear and relief." I stared at my walls, at the rows of quiet doors leaning against them like well-behaved children waiting for school. They'd been my private companions for months, but maybe it was time to let them go learn their own lessons. I chose 4 pieces, wrote their titles by hand, and felt the serif in my name soften as I signed. The opening night was full of polite wine and paper name tags, but the viewers refused to be polite. They leaned in close, fingers hovering over paint like they might feel a heartbeat beneath it. A man in a navy blazer murmured, "You can't sell safety, you can only practice it." I almost thanked him for summarizing my life, but decided silence was enough applause. Weeks passed. Then came the letter the museum wanted to acquire door with Mercy West Wall. Acquisition sounded bureaucratic, but the joy it delivered didn't. It was the kind of happiness that arrives on letterhead. I signed the documents and pressed my tiny gold key silhouette on the duplicate. Signatures are promises after all made visible. Business grew quietly like ivy, slow, certain never asking if it was allowed. The 2 rooms of my gallery began breathing in sync. People stopped saying your shop and started saying your space. I didn't correct them. Both were true. Then came a letter that slowed the air around me. Dylan's grandmother had passed away. She was the one who'd given me the gold key years earlier, the woman who said my hands looked trustworthy. A niece wrote, "She liked knowing you kept it. She said some items deserve careers." I went to the memorial, stood in the back, didn't speak to Dylan. The service was small, the way certain truths prefer to be. She passed quietly. I stood at the back. The key felt heavier, like it remembered her. Afterward, one of her cousins told a story about getting locked out of the farmhouse as a kid and crawling through the cellar window. "I was too old for it," she said, smiling through tears. But keys are just a polite way of asking. That night I walked home slower than usual, listening to the city hum like an unfinished song. I thought of that key, the one in my pocket, and realized how many doors had agreed to trust me since I'd started carrying it. Maybe it wasn't just a keepsake. Maybe it was a curriculum. The following month, a small magazine featured my work under the headline, "The Woman Who Paints Openings." They called the gold key my signature, though I never said it was. A curator from another city emailed to ask if I ever considered teaching. "You make openings, not objects," she wrote. "That's a language others might want to learn." I didn't answer right away. I was still learning what it meant to teach without preaching, to share without shrinking. But the thought lingered. By the end of that second year, I noticed something subtle but steady. The gallery had stopped needing me to explain it. People walked in, exhaled, and found their own metaphors. I overheard 2 strangers once, "She paints doors." "No," the other said. "She paints exits that don't hurt." That sentence felt like a benediction. Before closing that night, I stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms. the one I'd left doorless, and watched the light stretch across the floor, a thin river of gold leaf reflection. I thought about how much had changed in 12 months: the dusted glass, the painted hinge, the sound of the bell, now recognized by regulars as reassurance. I locked both doors, turned the key once then again, just to feel the weight of it working. The air smelled like sawdust and progress. I thought of Dylan's text from a year ago, the one that tried to define my size. Somewhere he was likely telling another woman what was or wasn't enough. But I had built a life measured not in his words, but in my openings. As I slid the key into the dish by the sink, I caught its glint under the lamp and smiled. It no longer looked like something borrowed from another family's story. It looked like a word I'd finally learned to pronounce. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one, steady, ceremonial. The city was full of doors, and most of them didn't know my name yet, but they would. Minnie climaxed the museum acquisition and the quiet expansion into 2 rooms, proof that her work now speaks a new language. Twist the key that once tied her to Dylan's world now belongs wholly to her, the emblem of a vocabulary she invented. Pause. I turned off the lights, and for a moment the glass caught the last glow of evening. The reflection looked like another door opening somewhere I hadn't painted yet. Chapter 3. Doors Teach Weather. They said quiet women disappear. I decided to echo. Year 3 taught me that repetition isn't routine, it's conversation. Each morning I spoke to the same walls, the same brushes, the same smell of turpentine and possibility, and they answered in tones only patience can hear. Success stopped feeling like applause and started feeling like steady breath. The gallery had grown a rhythm. Maya opened the shutters. Liam leveled the frames, and I arrived with coffee that always cooled before the first stroke of paint. Customers no longer looked around as if asking permission. They entered like people crossing into memory. "This place feels alive," Maya said one afternoon as she rearranged postcards on the counter. "It should I told her. Everything that learns still breathes." We had regulars now, a woman who came every Friday just to sit under the skylight, an older couple who said they visited to see how the light behaves. It felt like the shop had its own pulse. That spring I began a new series, Doors in Storms. Not theatrical hurricanes or cinematic lightning, but soft, stubborn rain, the kind that ages paint instead of ruining it. I spent days sketching in quiet neighborhoods where the porches sagged and the mailboxes leaned. An old man with a dog told me his mother never locked their front door. Her welcome was full-time work, he said. I left the lock plate unpainted on that piece, a deliberate omission like letting air into a sealed jar. Then came an email from a coastal gallery. They wanted a solo show. "We love that your doors don't announce themselves," the director wrote. "They appear." I rented a truck and packed the canvases like traveling relatives. The gold key came to resting in my pocket like a steady pulse. The opening smelled of salt and varnish. People moved through the room with the reverence you save for unfamiliar beauty. A couple argued softly about whether a certain blue leaned more towards sky or sea. A teenage girl stood in front of Door After Rain and whispered, "It looks like home, but smarter." Dylan's name appeared that same week, glowing on my phone like an old ghost politely knocking. "I'm in the area. Can I stop by to see what you've built?" I let the message sit, then replied, "The gallery is open to the public, noon to 6. He answered I meant something more personal. I didn't. Noon to 6. He arrived on a Tuesday. The space was quiet except for the hum of the lights. He stood in front of Door After Weatherhands, in pockets, expression half curious, half regret. "You always had a way with small hardware," he said. The comment might have once felt like praise. Now it sounded like someone reading from an old map of a city that had moved. "I learned to do it without breaking it," I said. He nodded, eyes searching the frames. "Your touch hasn't changed." "It has," I said softly. "That's why everything else did too." We stood in that polite silence that follows 2 people who finally speak the same language but no longer need it. He didn't ask to buy anything. He signed the guest book instead, "Proud of you." The words wore cologne and nostalgia, but no weight. I left them there anyway. Every book needs a misprint. A few days later, the gallery's front door jingled, and a young customer, barely 20, paint on her jeans, stood shyly holding one of my postcards. "You make doors for everyone?" she asked. "No," I said, smiling. "Just for those still searching for one." She nodded as if she understood more than she could explain, then left with a print wrapped in paper that said, "Handle gently." That small exchange felt more important than the compliments that came with champagne. It reminded me why the work breathed. The Coastal Show sold 2 pieces the first night. The director said we should celebrate. I said we already were. In the weeks that followed, a manufacturer reached out about creating limited editions. I agreed only if each print carried an embossed gold key raised, not printed, so the mark could be felt rather than seen. "You'll never keep up with the numbering," the rep warned. "We will," I said, glancing at Maya and Liam. "We've learned the rhythm." When the first batch shipped, I ran my fingers over the embossed corner, silent proof that success can hum instead of shout. Later that year, the community college invited me to speak about art and persistence. I wore the blazer I reserved for paperwork, not paint. The students were young and restless, their notebooks full of futures. I told them about the sentence that once tried to measure me: "You'll never be enough." I didn't say his name. I didn't need to. I realized I didn't want his enough, I told them. It was an unstable unit of measure. I held up the gold key. Now I measure by thresholds, crossed, names signed, and promises kept. A student in a red scarf raised her hand. "Did you forgive him?" I smiled. I forgave myself first for staying too long in a house that taught me the wrong weather. The room fell into the kind of silence that doesn't need applause. When class ended, a few students lingered, tracing the key with their eyes. One of them whispered, as she passed me, "Thank you for showing us the hinge." Driving home that night, I thought about the word weather. It can mean storm or endurance, fury or patience. The trick is knowing which one you're in. Back at the gallery, Maya had left the lights on. Through the window, I could see the reflection of the champagne-colored door glimmering against the street. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and listened. The building sighed the way old wood does when it recognizes its keeper. I placed the key in the dish by the sink. It felt warm, like it had been working too. Mini climax. The Coastal Show and the first limited editions mark Rachel's rise from survival to craft. Twist Dylan's return delivers no closure, only proof his approval arrives too late to be currency. Pause. The gold key glints beneath lamplight, steady as heartbeat. Rachel whispers to no one in particular, "Some storms teach you where to build next." Chapter 4. Every door learns my name. They said quiet women disappear. I decided to echo. By year 4, the gallery no longer felt like proof. It felt like a practice, an act of breathing that carried other people's air. I stopped checking if anyone was still watching. They were. More importantly, they were using what I made. A nonprofit helping women rebuild after leaving violent homes asked if I would create something for their new space. "Not a mural," the director said, "something they can touch when their hands are shaking." We built a wall of small doors. Behind each door, a mirror. On each mirror, a note: "You're still here. You are the one with the keys." I pressed a tiny gold key silhouette in the corner of each, less a signature than a witness. The day we installed it, there was laughter, cookies, a few quiet tears that belonged exactly where they fell. A woman opened one of the tiny doors, saw her reflection, and whispered, "Enough." The word found its home again. After that, people started calling me the artist of welcome. A magazine used it as a headline, and I blushed like a child being praised in public. They photographed the storefront at dusk. The champagne door held light as if it were its own guest. The article described my work as a study in mercy disguised as architecture. Orders multiplied. I learned to say "not yet" instead of "no," a small luxury of survival. One afternoon, a city council member came to the gallery with an idea. "There's an alley downtown," she said. "Empty, gray, ignored. Could you make it sing?" We gathered a table and invited strangers to write a word that opens something for them, one word per key. Home peace visa. Dad, quiet tomorrow. We hung each key on thin wire across the alley until they shimmered in the wind. When the breeze came, they sounded like rain, soft and honest. People lingered listening. Some cried not out of sadness but relief. I added my own key near the center engraved with one word name. When it moved, I swore I heard it answer back. Later that month, a high-end hotel reached out. "We want something grand," the manager said. "Doors that make guests feel important." "Important or welcome?" I asked. He hesitated. "Welcome." That was enough for me. I built 2 tall frames, narrow at the top, wide where shoulders pass. Painted them a quiet gray and softened the brass handles so they'd feel like a handshake instead of a barrier. When we installed them, the lobby seemed to exhale. The next morning, a bellman left a note on hotel stationery. "No one knows why the lobby feels kinder. It's the doors." A few weeks later, the museum from my second year wrote again. They wanted a retrospective 5 years of thresholds. The curator, a woman with eyes like long patience, walked through my studio with her notebook open. "Your titles do pastoral work," she said. "They calm people down before the art does." We chose 22 pieces, some from the early days when the gold leaf trembled under my hands, others from the Storm series where color held its own weather. She paused in front of a frame from my first gallery door. "Does the key always go here?" she asked, pointing to the corner. "No," I said, "but it always shows up." The opening wasn't a party, it was a quiet arrival. The museum lights were soft, the crowd generous. The wall text read, "Doors are not metaphors in Merritt's work, they are instruments. They tune rooms to human pitch." I watched people drift through the rooms as if they were learning a language they already knew. In the final room, a table with paper and crayons invited visitors to draw their own doors. A boy drew a rectangle with a dragon. His mother wrote college under hers. A man in his 70s labeled his small, careful square apology. When it was time for the speech, I stood behind the podium, hands steady. I didn't mention Dylan. "He wasn't the point anymore. I once thought beauty needed to shout to be seen," I said. "Now I know it just needs to stay long enough to be useful. This work is useful. Maybe beauty is just usefulness dressed for company." The audience was silent, not the kind of silence that means confusion, but the kind that means they were still listening inside themselves. After the applause softened, I walked through the exhibition alone. Each door seemed to exhale when I passed, as if the hinges recognized their maker. I stopped by a woman tracing her fingers over a gold silhouette and heard her whisper to her child, "This is what kindness looks like when it learns structure." Outside, the alley of keys shimmered in the night breeze, catching light from the museum windows. The sound of them metal air, the low chorus of strangers who dared to write their word, rose and fell like rain. I thought about the first door I painted, the one he said was too on the nose. I smiled at how wrong he had been. Sometimes the nose knows where the truth begins. The museum's director walked me out and shook my hand. "You've built more than art," she said. "You've built permission." Maybe that was all I had ever wanted, to give permission to myself and to others, to open what was meant to open. Mini climax. The alley sings in keys, the hotel breathes easier, and the museum hangs her name among others who built beauty out of endurance. Twist. The world doesn't change because Dylan understands her. It changes because strangers practice kindness in front of her work. Pause. As Rachel leaves the museum, the night wind lifts 100 small keys into motion. They sound like applause, but softer, like doors learning her name. Chapter 5. The House That Knows My Name. They said quiet women disappear. I decided to echo. The 5th year wasn't a victory lap. It was a housewarming. I'd opened a second space 3 doors down from the original, as if the city itself had decided to mirror my growth. The first gallery remained calm and steady, a shrine to beginnings. The new one buzzed with sawdust paint and possibility. We called it the studio, not the school, because school implies correction, and this place preferred invitation. At twilight, the space smelled of pine and courage. People came after work, bringing stories more fragile than they looked. We offered wood color, small hinges, and time. Make what you need, I told them. A nurse built a door with a latch only she could reach. It's for nights when the world wants too much, she said. A retired carpenter framed the letter he never sent to his son. Maybe forgiveness can have wood grain, he murmured. A teenager painted a door the green of a healing bruise and smiled when it dried. It looks alive, she whispered. Those 3 doors sat side by side, imperfect and glowing, proof that the work had become a language others could speak. One rainy Tuesday, Dylan walked in. He didn't text first this time. He just arrived carrying the quiet of someone who'd rehearsed his own entrance. He looked around at the shelves of small doors and sketches. The rain clung to his coat like apologies. I got sober, he said softly, like the sentence might break if he pushed too hard. I nodded. The room didn't tense. It breathed. He stopped in front of a frame I'd finished that morning, oak and gold leaf catching the muted light. You were always building, he said. I was always naming. It wasn't an apology, it was an inventory. I told myself you were small because I needed to feel large. He exhaled, and for once he didn't look at me like a mirror. You weren't small. Forgiveness didn't arrive with a trumpet. It sat down quietly. I measured myself by doorways I hadn't yet crossed, I told him. That was bad math. I've changed the units. I took a small tin key from a nail by the desk and placed it in his hand. This opens the back gate. It's for deliveries. Use it if you ever need to drop something off without knocking. He closed his fingers around it until the metal warmed. Then he left without touching a single frame. The door closed behind him like a gentle period. No echo, no resentment, just closure written in soft light. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at the gallery. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. A woman from another city wrote, I left a marriage that shrank me into a hallway. I hung one of your prints by my bed. I touch the embossed key before I sleep. I dream of rooms that know me. I read it at the counter while Maya arranged pencils in a jar like flowers. Neither of us spoke for a while. The following spring, a fellowship invitation arrived from a foundation I used to Google with quiet hunger. For artists whose work changes how we gather, it said. I went. The residency was held in an old monastery where doors had once meant vows and now meant options. I spent a month sketching silence. I built a small door that opened to a mirror and etched beneath the glass, tiny but legible, welcome back. When I returned home, the city felt softer, like it had learned my pace. The alley of keys was still singing. Some had rusted, others had gone missing, but the sound was whole. The council added a small plaque, Rachel Merritt, 5 years of thresholds. Children tugged their parents' hands to listen to the metal chime. One boy asked why it sounded like rain. Because a lot of people had something to say, his father answered. That evening I visited the first gallery, the champagne-colored door glowing in the sunset. I unlocked it with the gold key, the same one that had survived 5 years of pockets and purpose. Inside, the quiet felt alive, like the building recognized me. I sat at the counter, pulled a blank sheet of paper, and began a letter not to Dylan, not to the city, but to the girl who once thought silence was surrender. You will carry a key someone once dismissed. It will fit every door you dare to build. You will stop arguing your size and start designing your space. You will not rebuild. You will realign. And when they ask how you did it, you will point to the thresholds, cross the names, sign the rooms that stayed kind. I folded the letter, placed it under the dish where the gold key rested, and smiled. The streetlight outside flickered on, catching the reflection of my name on the glass, small, steady enough. As I turned the sign to closed, a woman paused outside, peering through the window. Her eyes landed on a framed piece where a heavy door leaned slightly against its hinge, unfinished but honest. She mouthed, "Oh, not like surprise, but like recognition." I opened the door and called softly, "We're still open if you need to come in." She stepped inside, Sometimes mercy sounds like an open door after hours. I lock up for the night, cleaning the glass the way I've learned to clean grief, small circles, light pressure, patience. The gold key gleams under the lamp, no longer a relic, but a tool. If the story met you at a threshold, step through. If it found you outside a house that forgot your name, turn the key. And if you ever doubt how strong gentle can be, watch any door that carries my signature. It opens.